Yo, thought I'd get my read on. Continuing on with propaganda, the formation of men's attitudes. Bad attitudes, more like. You know what I'm saying? Okay, categories of propaganda. Despite a general belief, propaganda is not simply phenomenon, and one cannot lump together all of its forms. Types of propaganda can be distinguished by regimes that employ them. Soviet propaganda and American propaganda do not resemble each other either in method or in psychological technique. Hitler's propaganda was very different from present-day Chinese propaganda, but it substantially resembled Stalinist propaganda. The propaganda of the FLN in Algeria cannot be compared to French propaganda. Even within the same regime, completely different conceptions can coexist. The Soviet Union is the most striking example of this. The propagandas of Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev offer three types which differ in their techniques, in their themes, and in their symbolism, so much so that when we set up too narrow a frame for the definition of propaganda, part of the phenomenon eludes us. Those who think of Soviet propaganda only as it was under Stalin are inclined to say that Khrushchev's does not make propaganda. But Khrushchev's propaganda was as extensive as Stalin's, and perhaps more so. He carried certain propaganda techniques to their very limits. But aside from these political and external categories of propaganda, one must define other differences that rest on certain internal traits of propaganda. Political propaganda and sociological propaganda. First, we must distinguish between political propaganda and sociological propaganda. We shall not dwell long on the former, because it is the type called immediately to mind by the word propaganda itself. It involves techniques of influence employed by a government, a party, an administration, a pressure group with a view to changing the behavior of the public. The choice of methods used is deliberate and calculated. The desired goals are clearly distinguished and quite precise, though generally limited. Most often, the themes and the objectives are political, as for example with Hitler's or Stalin's propaganda. This is the type of propaganda that can be most clearly distinguished from advertising. The latter has economic ends, the former political ends. Political propaganda can be either strategic or tactical. The former establishes the general line, the array of arguments, the staggering of campaigns. The latter seeks to obtain immediate results within that framework, such as wartime pamphlets and loudspeakers to obtain the immediate surrender of the enemy. But this does not cover all propaganda, which also encompasses phenomena much more vast and less certain. The group of manifestations by which any society seeks to integrate the maximum number of individuals into itself, to unify its members' behavior according to a pattern, to spread its style of life abroad, and thus to impose itself on other groups. We call this phenomenon sociological propaganda. To show, first of all, that the entire group, consciously or not, expresses itself in this fashion, and to indicate, secondly, that its influence aims much more at an entire style of life than at opinions or even one particular course of behavior. This notion is a little broader than that of Doob on unintentional propaganda. Doob includes the term the involuntary effects obtained by the propagandist. He is the first to have stressed the possibility of this unintentional character of propaganda, contrary to all American thought on the subject, except for David Kreck and Richard S. Crutchfield, who go even further in gauging the range of unintentional propaganda, which they even find in books on mathematics. Of course, within the compass of sociological propaganda itself, one or more political propagandas can be expressed. The propaganda of Christianity in the Middle Ages is an example of this type of sociological propaganda. Benjamin Constant meant just this when he said of France in 1793, the entire nation was a vast propaganda operation. And in present times, certainly, the most accomplished models of this type are American and Chinese propaganda, although we do not include here the more or less effective campaigns and methods employed by governments, but rather the overall phenomenon. We find that sociological propaganda combines extremely diverse forms within itself. At this level, advertising, as the spreading of a certain style of life, can be said to be included in such propaganda, and in the United States this is also true of public relations, human engineering, motion pictures, and so on. It is characteristic of a nation living by sociological propaganda that these influences converge toward the same point, whereas in a society such as France in 1960, they are divergent in their objectives and their intentions. Hey, babe. What you doing? Sociological propaganda is a phenomenon much more difficult to grasp than political propaganda, and is rarely discussed. Basically, it is the penetration of an ideology by means of its sociological context. This phenomenon is the reverse of what we have been studying up to now. Propaganda, as it traditionally known, implies an attempt to spread an ideology through the mass media of communication in order to lead public to accept some political or economic structure or to participate in some action. That is one element common to all propaganda we have studied. Ideology is disseminated for the purpose of making various political acts acceptable to the people. But in sociological propaganda, the movement is reversed. The existing economic, political, and sociological factors progressively allow an ideology to penetrate individuals or masses. Through the medium of economic and political structures, a certain ideology is established, which leads to the active participation of the masses and the adaptation of the individuals. The important thing is to make the individual participate actively and to adapt him as much as possible to a specific sociological context. Such propaganda is essentially diffuse. It is rarely conveyed by catchwords or expressed intentions. Instead, it is based on general climate and atmosphere that influences people imperceptibly without having the appearance of propaganda. It gets to man through his customs, through his most unconscious habits. It creates new habits in him. It is a sort of persuasion from within. As a result, man adopts new criteria of judgment and choice, adopts them spontaneously, as if he had chosen them himself. But all these criteria are in conformity with the environment and are essentially of a collective nature. Sociological propaganda produces a progressive adaptation to a certain order of things, a certain concept of human relations, which unconsciously molds individuals and makes them conform to society. Sociological propaganda springs up spontaneously. It is not the result of deliberate propaganda action. No propagandists deliberately use this method, though many practiced it unwittingly and tend in this direction without realizing it. For example, when an American producer makes a film, he has a certain definite ideas he wants to express, which are not intended to be propaganda. Rather, the propaganda element is the American way of life, with which he is permeated, and which he expresses in his film without realizing it. We see here the force of expansion of a vigorous society, which is totalitarian in the sense of the integration of the individual and which leads to involuntary behavior. Sociological propaganda expresses itself in many different ways in advertising, in the movies, commercial and non-political films, in technology in general, in education, in the Reader's Digest, and in social service, casework, and settlement houses. All these influences are in basic accord with each other and lead spontaneously in the same direction. One hesitates to call all this propaganda. Such influences, which mold behavior, seem a far cry from Hitler's great propaganda setup. Unintentional, at least in the first stage, non-political, organized along spontaneous patterns and rhythms. The activities we have lumped together from a concept that might be judged arbitrarily or artificial, are not considered propaganda by either sociologists or the average public. And yet, with deeper and more objective analysis, what does one find? These influences are expressed through the same media as propaganda. They are really directed by those who make propaganda. To me, this fact seems essential. A government, for example, will have its own public relations and will also make propaganda. Most of the activities described in this chapter have identical purposes. Besides, these influences follow the same stereotypes and prejudices as propaganda. They stir the same feeling and act on the individual in the same fashion. These are similarities which bring these two aspects of propaganda closer together, more than the differences noted earlier separate them. But there is more. Such activities are propaganda to the extent that the combination of advertising, public relations, social welfare, and so on produces a certain general conception of society, a particular way of life. We have not grouped these activities together arbitrarily. They express the same basic notions and interact to make man adopt this particular way of life. From then on, the individual in the clutches of such sociological propaganda believes that those who live this way are on the side of the angels, and those who don't are bad. Those who have this conception of society are right, and those who have another conception are in error. Consequently, just as with ordinary propaganda, it is a matter of propagating behavior and myths, both good and bad. Furthermore, such propaganda becomes increasingly effective when those subjected to it accept its doctrines on what is good or bad. For example, the American way of life. There, a whole society actually expresses itself through this propaganda by advertising its kind of life. By doing that, a society engages in propaganda on the deepest level. Sociologists have recognized that, Above all, propaganda must change a person's environment. Kretsch and Crutchfield insist on this fact and show that a simple modification of the psychological context can bring about changes of attitude without ever directly attacking particular attitudes or opinions. Similarly, McDougall says, one must avoid attacking any trend frontally. It is better to concentrate one's effort on the creation of psychological conditions so that the desired result seems to come from them naturally. The modification of the psychological climate brings about still other consequences that one cannot obtain directly. This is what Ogle calls suggestibility. The degree of suggestibility depends on man's environment and psychological climate, and that is precisely what modifies the activities mentioned above. It is what makes them propaganda, for their aim is simply to instill in the public an attitude that will prepare the ground for the main propaganda to follow. Sociological propaganda must act gently. Its conditions, it introduces a truth and ethic in various benign forms, which, although sporadic, end by creating a fully established personality structure. It acts slowly by penetration. It is most effective in a relatively stable and active society, or in the tensions between an expanding society and one that is disintegrating, or in an expanding group within a disintegrating society. Under these conditions, it is sufficient in itself. It is not merely a preliminary sub-propaganda, but sociological propaganda is inadequate in a moment of crisis, nor is it able to move the masses to action in exceptional circumstances. Therefore, it must sometimes be strengthened by the classic kind of propaganda, which leads to action. At such times, sociological propaganda will appear to be the medium that has prepared the ground for direct propaganda. It becomes identified with sub-propaganda. Nothing is easier than to graft a direct propaganda onto a setting prepared by sociological propaganda. Besides, sociological propaganda may itself be transformed into direct propaganda. Then, by a series of intermediate stages, we not only see one turn into the other, but also a smooth transition from what was merely a spontaneous affirmation of a way of life to the deliberate affirmation of a truth. This process has been described in an article by Edward L. Bernays. This so-called engineering approach is tied to a combination of professional research methods, though which one gets people to adopt and actively support certain ideas or programs as soon as they become aware of them. This applies also to political matters, and since 1936, the National Association of Manufacturers has attempted to fight the development of leftist trends with such methods. In 1938, the NAM spent $500,000 to support the type of capitalism it represents. This sum was increased to $3 million in 1945 and to $5 million in 1946. This propaganda paved the way for the Taft-Hartley Law. It was a matter of selling the American economic system. Here we are truly in the domain of propaganda, and we see the multiple methods employed to influence opinion, as well as the strong tie between sociological and direct propaganda. Sociological propaganda, involuntary at first, becomes more and more deliberate and ends up by exercising influence. One example is the code drawn up by the Motion Picture Association, which requires films to promote the highest types of social life, the proper conception of society, the proper standards of life, and to avoid any ridicule of law, natural or human, or sympathy for those who violate law. Another is J. Arthur Rank's explanation of the purpose of his films. When does an export article become more than an export article? When it is a British film. When the magnificent productions of Ealing Studios appear in the world, they represent something better than just a step forward toward a higher level of export. Such films are then propaganda for the British way of life. The first element of awareness in the context of sociological propaganda is extremely simple, and from it everything else derives. What starts out as a simple situation gradually turns into a definite ideology, because the way of life in which man thinks he is so indisputably well off becomes a criterion of value for him. This does not mean that objectively he is well off, but that, regardless of the merits of his actual condition, he thinks he is. He is perfectly adapted to his environment, like a fish in water. From that moment on, everything that expresses this particular way of life, that reinforces and improves it, is good. Everything that tends to disturb, criticize, or destroy it is bad. This leads people to believe that the civilization representing their way of life is best. This belief then commits the French to the same course as the Americans, who are by far the most advanced in this direction. Obviously, one tries to imitate and catch up to those who are furthest advanced, and the first one becomes the model. And such imitation makes French adopt the same criteria of judgment, the same sociological structures, the same spontaneous ideologies, and in the end, the same type of man. Sociological propaganda is then a precise form of propaganda. It is comparatively simple because it uses all social currents, but is slower than other types of propaganda because it aims at long-term penetration and progressive adaptation. So we see this happening today with the Chinese way of life is being pushed onto us. Like our movies are starting to censor themselves so they can be shown in China, thus censoring them here, thus supporting like Chinese standards of life, not American. Or Hollywood is now supporting Chinese standards of life instead of American, because they get more money from Chinese, because there's so many billion people in China. But from the instant man uses that way of life as his criterion of good and evil, he is led to make judgments. For example, anything un-American is evil. From then on, genuine propaganda limits itself to the use of this tendency and to leading man into actions of either compliance with or defense of the established order. Sociological propaganda in the United States is a natural result of the fundamental elements of American life. In the beginning, the United States had to unify a disparate population that came from all the countries of Europe and had diverse traditions and tendencies. A way of rapid assimilation had to be found. That was the great political problem of the United States at the end of the 19th century. The solution was psychological standardization, that is, simply to use a way of life as the basis of unification and as an instrument of propaganda. In addition, this uniformity plays another decisive role, an economic role, in the life of the United States. It determines the extent of the American market. Mass production requires mass consumption, but there cannot be mass consumption without widespread, identical views as to what the necessities of life are. One must be sure that the market will react rapidly and massively to a given proposal or suggestion. One therefore needs fundamental psychological unity on which advertising can play with certainty when manipulating public opinion. And in order to form public opinion to respond, it must be convinced of the excellence of all that is American. Thus, conformity of life and conformity of thought are indissolubly linked. But such conformity can lead to unexpected extremes. Given American liberalism and the confidence of Americans in their economic strength and their political system, it is difficult to understand the wave of collective hysteria which occurred after 1948 and culminated in McCarthyism. That hysteria probably sprang from a vague feeling of ideological weakness, a certain inability to define the foundations of American society. That is why Americans seek to define the American way of life, to make it conscious, explicit, theoretical, worthy. Therefore, soul-searching and inflexibility with excessive affirmations designed to mask the weakness of the ideological position. All this obviously constitutes an ideal framework for organized propaganda. We encounter such organized propaganda on many levels, on the government level for one. Then there are the different pressure groups, the Political Action Committee, the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, the National Small Business Men's Association. All have their aim the defense of the private interests of the big three: big business, big labor, and big agriculture. Other groups aim at social and political reforms: the American Legion, the League of Women Voters, and the like. These groups employ lobbying to influence the government and the classic forms of propaganda to influence the public through films, media, and radio. They try to make the public aware of their ideological aims. Another very curious and recent phenomenon, confirmed by several American sociologists, is the appearance of agitators alongside politicians and political propagandists. The pure agitator, who steers the public opinion in the disinterested fashion, functions as a nationalist. Is this Trump? He does not appeal to a doctrine or principle, nor does he propose specific reforms. He is the true prophet of the American way of life. Usually he is against the New Deal and for laissez-faire liberalism, against plutocrats, internationalists, and socialists. Oh, it's Trump. Bankers and communists alike are the hateful other party in spite of which well-informed I survives. The agitator is especially active in the most unorganized groups of the United States. He uses the anxiety psychosis of the lower middle classes, the neo-proletarian, the immigrant, the demobilized soldier, people who are not yet integrated into American society or who have not yet adopted ready-made habits and ideas. The agitator uses the American way of life to provoke anti-Semitic, anti-communist, anti-Negro, and xenophobic currents of opinion. They don't send us their best, they send us their drug dealers, their rapists, and their criminals. He makes groups act in the illogical yet coherent Manichaean universe, like Mac. I don't know what that is. He makes groups act in the illogical yet coherent Manichaean universe of propaganda. Manichaean universe of propaganda. I don't know. Of which we will have more to say. The most remarkable thing about this phenomenon is that these agitators do not work for a political party. It is not clear which interests they serve. They are neither capitalists nor communists, but they deeply influence American public opinion, and their influence may crystallize suddenly in unexpected forms. The more conscious such sociological propaganda is, the more it tends to express itself externally, and hence to expand its influence abroad, for example in Europe. It frequently retains its sociological character, and thus does not appear to be pure and simple propaganda. There is no doubt, for example, that the Marshall Plan, which was above all a real form of aid to underdeveloped countries, also had propaganda elements, such as the spreading of American products and films, coupled with publicity about what the United States was doing to aid underprivileged nations. These two aspects of indirect propaganda are altogether sociological, but they may be accompanied by specific propaganda, as when, in 1948, subsidies of $15 million were poured into American publications appearing in Europe. The French edition of the New York Herald Tribune stated that it received important sums in Marshall credits for the purpose of making American propaganda, along with reviews specializing in propaganda such as France Amerique, and with film centers and libraries sponsored by the Americans in Europe. We should include the Reader's Digest, whose circulation has reached millions of copies per issue in Europe and is so successful that it no longer needs a subsidy. However, the success of such American propaganda is very uneven. Technical publications have assured audience, but bulletins and brochures have little effect because the Americans have a superiority complex, which expresses itself in such publications and displeases foreigners. The presentation of the American way of life is the only way to salvation, exasperates French opinion, and makes such propaganda largely ineffective in France. At the same time, French opinion has been won over by the obvious superiority of American technical methods. All forms of sociological propaganda are obviously very diffuse and aimed much more at the promulgation of ideas and prejudices, of a style of life, than of a doctrine, or at inciting action or calling for formal adherence. They represent a penetration in depth until a precise point is struck at which action will occur. It should be noted, for example, that in all French departments in which there were Americans and propaganda bureaus, the number of communist voters decreased between 1951 and 1953. And we'll end there. Yay! Reading is fun. We're smarter than everybody. Yay!